Live now.
Okay.
And so I made you host. So if you click the button in the top left, you can view the stream on YouTube or copy the link. And then Amar, you have the ability to live stream. So before you end the meeting, at the end of the just click end.
Sorry, say that one more time before the end of the meeting.
Just click that live on YouTube button and then stop the stream.
Okay, perfect. And okay, all right. And then we'll add the first section of the presentation to the video.
Yeah, we'll probably do that later this week or next week.
Not a problem. Just making sure that everyone is on the video when it's on YouTube.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you for your help. All right. So, guys, do you want to get your presentation up? And when we will have everyone, we can get started. Any other comments about what we saw, the two first projects from anyone? Jason, Clément, Yves?
Hello. You try to put all the project all together of all the sites and see what it gives?
Usually what we do is build a site model. And at the end of the semester, we put all the projects on the site model, and it's great. Unfortunately, this time with online, we were not able to achieve this, but that's what we did in last year, and that's the initial idea for it. And I think it's a great, it's a great point to see, the context as it exists today, and by adding 6 more projects at once to it, and these projects see how the urban scape changes. I think we almost have everyone here. We're missing Carol. And if I can request from all the students, please leave your cameras on. It's always nice to see faces. Okay, just for the sake of time, it's a little bit after 3. We still have 4 projects to go. Let's go ahead and start this presentation.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello. My name is Mandy. I'm a first-year international graduate student here at Tulane.
Hello, my name is Hong Liu. I'm a second-year international student here in 2-year program.
Today we'll be talking about our building, Canvas NOLA, which is an artist in residence and workplace located on 1600 Magazine Street in New Orleans. So first we started off with defining what contemporaneity meant to our project. We defined it as contemporaneity in architecture is specific to its time, a junction that reflects the spatial conditions and specific elements in the context it inhabits. The contemporaneous nature of architecture can be expressed through materiality, spatial organization of programmatic elements, and its specificity within the context. Our area investigation is a focus on 12 blocks on Magazine Street. We found that there was more commercial projects on the left end. There was more residential within the middle and warehouse-like buildings on the right near Calliope Street. Also, New Orleans, this Magazine Street is known for its food and drink, shopping, art galleries, and crafts.
And we start to think a building type in relation to our areas of investigations. We do analysis of traffic flow within the New Orleans, and the darker lines represent the more density traffic. We can see the strong traffic relationship in the vertical axis, but how could we create a relationship in the horizontal axis? And how could we create a positive impact on the vitality of the surrounding communities? We try to explore building with the kind of type-based program that could extend along the Magazine Street.
Art is a significant part of New Orleans culture and context, so we considered it as a potential programmatic basis. We explored the distribution of art spaces within New Orleans and found clusters of blue, which represent art and artist-centric spaces. And we find that there's a horizontal axis appearing. We zoomed into these clusters and found 4 major areas within New Orleans with a focus on art: the Central Business District, French Quarter, the Warehouse District, along Julia Street, and there were a few spaces at the left end of Magazine Street.
So by incorporating major art spaces within our area of investigation, we have an opportunity to create a connection between these 4 spaces and Magazine Street. And our building should be a probable catalyst to simulate more artistic spaces along the Magazine Street. All this research lead us to consider where along the Magazine Street will be our building have the most impact.
So zooming in into our area of investigation, we find this bend in the grid along Felicity and Magazine, and it's due to the direction of the Mississippi River. Is there a suitable site to build along that bend? So zooming in further, we found an open lot at 1600 Magazine Street at the intersection of Richard, Magazine, and Felicity. And the shift in the grid creates this prominent junction that is peninsula-like and gives us an opportunity to create a connection that links Magazine to these other 4 districts. Some basic zoning information about our site. It's a historic urban neighborhood business district. Most important takeaway is that we can build up to 40 feet with a maximum of 3 stories. Building a mixed-use structure allows us to build to the extent of the site, and we are not including any parking as we're designing an artist in residence space, and they will be living and working within the building. There's no commute, and also this encourages pedestrian traffic.
And after we made the decision of the site on these 12 blocks, we start the site design process. We combine several of the design elements that could be potential factors to all the design phases. The first concept is the courtyard. Courtyards are contextually relevant to New Orleans. It allows for air circulation in hot and humid climate, bring enough sunlight to the project, and adds a landscape experience. Then we start to think of ways to enable our program to have some materiality features like transparent, translucent, and opaque. And the third concept is balconies. These are a big part of New Orleans cultures by reducing the boundaries between the interior and exterior spaces. A balconies allows for interaction between the public, semi-public, and private spaces. And the appearance of the roof deck create more public and interactive spaces in the building. Concept of the roof decks closely related to the balcony concepts. Both of them add rhythm to the building, and that is big ideas in our succession concept. Finally, we look for approach to lead the massive design process. We use the component ideas as the final method. I will explain more in the next slide. So why do we use the component concept? Here we have a difficulty. We have a really small site and how to create the sense of the skills that art building should have in such a compact spaces, and how could we functionalize the building into the mixed use properties. Component ideas works fine to solve these problems. And here, our approach is creating our programmatic elements into different pieces. Then we evaluate the units of potential programs and adjust the scale of them. Finally, we played with the rearrangement of these masses. And we have 3 parts of here, exploring the massing and create connections through the circulation, comparison of the spaces and spatial organization in the plan. and working with the components in the sections and the 3D. So we start playing with the massing generation following our approach. And the first thing we did is to split our site into several pieces. Then we can create some opening spaces into the site.
We adjusted these open spaces into courtyards, and then we added a second floor for semi-public spaces.
Then we add third floor as the private spaces, and we add the roof deck and balconies as the opening spaces in the second and third floor.
Our seventh step was our window placements and how we can play with transparencies to give consideration for natural and diffuse light for each space. Our last step was the screen system, which is a double facade metal screen system, which is contextually relevant to New Orleans' hot and humid climate. It's a strategic approach for its envelope. The shrink wrap like screen system creates this monolithic appearance that has a institutional feel and creates prominence along Magazine Street. During the day, the screen allows light to flood in, whereas during the night, the screen allows for artificial light to glow from the inside. The screen also unifies all of our small components and gives a distinction between public and private spaces. This is our site plan.
When we finished the design of the massing, we went back to discuss the relationship between the massing and the site. The first is the traffic analysis. There are few traffic flows when our site is empty. People and cars just rush through the site in this scenario. However, with the construction of the building, the traffic has been stressing along the Magazine Street. The small increases in traffic will significantly reduce the speed of cars passing through the intersections. The lower speed gives the drivers and passengers more opportunities to notice the building on the street. So perhaps in the future, these passengers will personally enter into this building, and that will bring a positive impact on the vitality of the surrounding communities. The change. Next slide, please.
Yes. This is the next one.
Okay. A change of the driving royalty and the passenger speed will affect activities of pedestrians around the site. So when a large of traffic and people gather here, people will stay at the intersection for more time. So every time they stay at the corner of the street, they can see the beautiful galleries inside with the several green spaces on the different floors. I mean that the building is free and open. So why don't they come into this building?
Our programmatic concept is to create a residence for artists, a hub that combines production through studios, presentations through galleries, and performances through experiences, while acting as a catalyst to stimulate and connect art spaces along Magazine Street. This is a list of our programmatic spaces within our building.
Okay, the first floor is very open in public areas. It be divided by different programs. A screen system unifies all of small components, allowing for the distinction between public and private spaces. So in the comprehensive plan, we can see multiple entries into the building, connecting the context to the site and acting like the extension of the sidewalk. There are green and water features between the galleries. The corridor will connect these components together. The second floor is the floor translated bounding from public to semi-public. The central courtyards and other green spaces on the second floor separate our building into public and semi-public area. In the comprehensive plan, we can see the beautiful public roof deck near the Facility Street, which could be reached by two different public stairs. The studio room is close to the apartment that helps artists to switch between the rest and works. The two stairs between the units help people circulate from the ground level to the top. The third floor is the private and interactive space. It's the relatively independent spaces warped by the screen system. In a comprehensive plan, we have a nice shared roof deck towards the richer street artists can drink and do barbecue here during their spare time. And the communal spaces is another interior shared spaces combine the kitchen and the dining room.
This is an axiometric plan showing the relationship of public and private spaces in 3D. In terms of materiality, we have three main material and wall treatments. The first one for full visibility is a screen with transparent glass, which allows natural light in. Our second one is for semi-visibility, which is the screen with translucent glass, which allows diffuse light in. And the third one is no visibility, which is the screen with a concrete wall. Our magazine street elevation, we see how the screen system wraps all over. There are public spaces along the first floor and with the main entrance on the right. The Richard Street elevation, we see how the screen system wraps over from Magazine Street and around the semi-public and private spaces on the second and third floor. The art galleries on the first floor are unwrapped and appear open and transparent into the building, giving a view inside to the courtyard. We have two spaces of interaction, one public cafe at the corner that pulls pedestrian traffic, and the second one on the third floor on the left, which is reserved for artists and interaction between them. Balconies wrap around within the screen system and connects the smaller programmatic components. We see, which is the horizontal connection, and we see two stairs connecting the first and second floor, the second and third floor, which are vertical connections. The Felicity Street elevation, we see the same way the screen system wraps over from Magazine Street. We see two different entrances, which is like the extension of the sidewalk to promote openness and encourage pedestrian traffic. We see three courtyards visible, and on the entrance on the right, we see how the greenery rolls from the sidewalk and into the courtyard.
The section A cartwheel along the Magazine Street, the spaces here is more transparent. And section B cuts through the center of the building. It shows the big courtyard ideas at the beginning of our concept. The landscape features and essential elements we want to include in our building. The third section cuts through the back of our building. We have another courtyard to compensate the sunlight. The entrance to the galleries and the roof deck, which is shown at the right of drawings, brings more independent spaces by this courtyard. And section D shows the cut along the corridor of the building. The component concept can be easily to reach through the drawings. It will be an interesting experience when people coming from the narrow stairs to big opening spaces. The final section shows the central courtyard in relation to the surrounding spaces within the building. The moralistic exterior is in contrast to the interior, which features open courtyards and circulation throughout the building.
This is our first rendered section, which cuts through the cafe, then the roof deck, the inner center courtyard, and the artist gallery and residences. And we see a clear separation through the central courtyard to separate the public and private spaces. This is a rendered section that cuts through the cafe, the double height lobby space, and the event spaces. This is the same cut as the rendered section number 1, but in the opposite direction. We again see the clear separation between the public, semi-public, and private spaces through the distinct courtyard in the center.
And here is a view from the Magazine Street. We can see the sense of realm of the building is transformed, the constituent change between the entity and the imaginaries. The light and shadow flow with the skin, and there are lots of interaction between the people, building, and the street.
This is a view from Richard Street at eye level. This is an evening view. However, during the daytime, as we saw earlier, the screen system gives the building an institutional monolithic appearance, allowing natural light to flow into the building. However, during the nighttime, the artificial light through the screen system makes the building appear more transparent and as if it were glowing.
So this is a view from the second floor of deck, look out towards to the city along the Facility Street. This is a public and open platform. People can sit on the table, read the books, and taste the food. The vision of the city is hazy, and the warm windows blows by. So your foot on the soft ground, and you are covered with the multiple channels of the trees. The strangers walked around you and greeted you, say, "Hey man, how are you doing?" So what a beautiful afternoon.
This is a view from the event space looking down into the lobby and cafe. And we see the transparency of walls and the views into the surrounding courtyards, and gives the users a feeling of connectedness throughout.
The aerial view shows a strong sense of layers with light building volumes totally. We can see people on different outdoor platforms and activities. The streets around the building are covered, are crowded, and the atmosphere inside the building is lively. Yet the vista of the city is serene. Although the building is divided into many small functional areas, the building looks pragmatic but connected.
And that is it.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I really like the project. I think it's interesting to see the kind of studio concept condensed into a building that has, while there's urban components to it, it's just really looking at a single site and how to address context, which I think is a big part of the studio concept. And I just think this is a really successful strategy where there is a lot of contemporary moves going on, but you've used the screen in a way that kind of unifies the form without making a disconnect between the building and the street. So I just think it's an interesting, just programmatically, everything seems to work for this site as a mixed use development. And I like the relationship with the street and how you dealt with the elevation offset. That's an awkward condition, I think, for a lot of program types. Like, it doesn't make sense to have an office where somebody's sitting in a desk right up against a window that's 3 feet higher than a pedestrian who's walking by, and the same thing with a restaurant. But the art studio actually makes a lot of sense there with a lot of transparency and glass, because it's a connection with the street that I think works really well. So I think this is a really interesting response to the studio.
Thank you.
I was going to make just a couple of presentation comments and then a question. For one, I noticed you didn't show any side photographs of what the area looks like today, which had the effect of sending me over to Google Street View and looking for myself. So I think it's helpful for the viewers to see just so they can reference it. A couple of maps you showed on pedestrian and traffic flow, the one with the purple and yellow dots. I wasn't quite sure if I was looking at empirical data that you had collected or envisioned data, this one over here. And then on the next map, with these movement of traffic, those swooping arrows, I must say, I really can't remember seeing traffic making those loops in a way that is so prominently displayed there. My question regards the location here and kind of the geographical reasoning of choosing the site. You did a really fine job of mapping out where art galleries and museums are today. And you mapped out a couple of clusters. And in geography, this is called agglomeration, when similar functions and businesses amass together. And they do so right there, right up, that one right there. They do so, let's not hit the button again. It's like blowing out my pupils.
I'm sorry.
Firms akin tend to assemble together because they benefit from their competition. In other words, the patrons, they benefit by being next to each other. And your design here strikes me something as that would be more at home and probably more successful if it were in the arts and museum district, the Camp Julia Contemporary Art Center, World War II Museum. So I guess my question is, why did you decide to use your mapping of these clusters as a reason to defy the clusters?
Well, we wanted to create a new cluster along Magazine Street, and we thought that by building along that bend, it would create a connection between the other clusters and hopefully stimulate another generation of art spaces along Magazine Street, which would eventually connect these spaces.
I presumed that that was your thinking, but here's the thing. These clusters form more organically from the bottom up rather than by ordination from the top down. You can't simply declare that there will be this business district over here.
Yeah, I understand. It was just a consideration we had. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just would like to share a few comments. I feel that the project has a lot of qualities in the fact that it's offering its own urbanity, but my fear is that it's actually trying to transform the reality of the site in your own urbanity. So what I mean is that in your representation, in some of the renderings, it sounds like everything is whitish, grayish. All of a sudden, your project is infusing the rest of the city. And I wonder, like, it sounds like it's a very good idea and it's up to date, this mesh thing. But it sounds like the context end up to be the same as your project. While I'd like to see, you know, in precisely in this image, I wonder, you know, whether you could be less, let's say, unifying, but actually contrasting in the sense that we could see your intervention within an actual context. I mean, I think it sounds like it's too pure, it's too arty, it's too perfect.
Okay. So
And that sounds like
have photographs instead of
yeah, I mean, it sounds like your project is forcing the way we should see the context.
Okay.
Somehow.
Yeah, my office is actually right by here where I am now, and I had a hard time even orienting myself really with the context. And I think to that point, it would not look as transparent as this image is showing right now. And I think it would have actually benefited the project to have the screens be more prominent, because it is such a contextual response in using that material to kind of tie the form together.
Okay. So visually, our renders should express the screen system a little more, like more better, like thicker, with more material.
And maybe I would have used colors behind the skin, so you have the diversity of the program all of a sudden unified with your strategy of mesh. I mean, it sounds like it's too whitey to be true.
Okay.
You know?
There's also that funky little florist building across the street that I can't help but always see at. I mean, you got to love that little weird thing.
Yeah. It definitely stands out.
I think your representation of the transparency is a little, it's like you're trying to, it seems like you're trying to use a rendering tool to make something which is not quite resolved enough to render. So that leaves you maybe with representing the concept of of this transparency and the different levels of transparency. You know, it's like, seems like you're trying to do everything within the rendering tool. And I think that's hanging you up a little bit. This doesn't look, I'm not picking up on on the subtleties of it. It looks like like a glass and like a foggy mirror in a steamed up bathroom or something. So You'd think maybe doing something more in Photoshop or something more just to get the concept across. Don't try to render it.
I also think just back to the overall flow of the presentation, just to pull back a little bit. I think y'all had some sequencing issues in there, and that lack of clarity in your narrative, I do think is showing up even in the comment that we just heard there, and that's important. You kind of oscillated between, you talked about the skin before you talked about the program. I found that funny, and you even alluded to organizational diagrams, setbacks, and all that again before you talked about the program. I'd probably invert that sequence. And it was important because you had a lot of extraneous diagramming in there. Some of the projects were missing diagrams, but they had very clear overall site strategies. Yours, I hang on your final comment, which is fragmented but connected. I do think that is true. But I think how you pulled us into there, you didn't edit yourself enough. I think your presentation was still kind of fragmented, meaning how you're organizing your thoughts is not clear enough. And it does show up to me in the architecture, even though I actually like this project too. Something weird about it. It's not quite right. All of the comments that people are acknowledging that it's not quite right, those are all very accurate comments. It's not, but there's almost a looseness to it that I don't think I could do that. I'd have to know a little more about these boxes you're creating and shifting on each other. Frankly, to me, that should show up in a very clear set of diagrams that's not there. You had a lot of diagrams, but you didn't edit them enough. And I think that would have helped us understand this kind of shifting of boxes that you're doing in plan. And like from your aerial roof plan, you can almost see it, but it's still not quite there. And I would want to believe it more, except that this rendering lets me know that, and your elevations, which to me were not effective. These somehow between your elevations and these renderings, maybe we can start to understand something, but I truly believe it's almost an organizational thing that you're off with, and you don't quite know what you're doing with the exterior of this building and its internal relationship. One more compliment though, if you were going to use a screen, I will say, Mandy, you as well, you did a good job of saying why one would use a screen. You referenced the climate, you referenced making something monolithic, you referenced blocking light during the day, but then letting it come out at night. Those are all good reasons, especially when I think about the previous project and the previous two projects and their lack of understanding of skin or explanation of why they're doing what they're doing. You did explain that. It's just that when we look at this rendering, it may be a little bit clumsy still, but the inherent logic you had, and that's important.
Thank you.
I really appreciated the project in three points. One is the site analysis, the large kind of scale of site analysis and how that relates to your decisions in terms of program and statement, and even the way you have chosen the place that is a corner. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then the sectional qualities are, I think, the second really important aspect of that proposal that I haven't found. It's not easy to find in projects of architecture. So taking advantage or exploding these sectional qualities of the object within itself and with the city, and the skin as a threshold interface between public and private. So those three things are really great, and they could have been maybe even the driver of the explanation of the project, in the sense that there is a moment in which you explain the massing and almost the design process instead of the main ideas, and how those ideas are picked from the culture of a place. So I think the idea of a skin and the thickness of a skin is really New Orleans in a way. So you can really emphasize that quality. So contemporary architecture with the properties, relational properties of the traditional architecture of New Orleans can be an argument. Another one in relation to the same thing, the sectional qualities, as well as clusters. So the idea of having clusters that are mixed use, not more than clusters because it's a mini cluster. The idea of mixing programs in a small space that is a property of not of the industrial city that segregates its functions, but it's mixing many different programs in the same space. So that is also something that is a quality of that environment. So contrasting the local appreciation of architecture into another language, architectural language, might be a way of explaining it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
A few things that I want to pick up on. It's kind of building off of what Ben and Jason were talking about, and I think it's related to the fragmented nature of the project, and I do really like it. You know, I mean, just first off the bat, I mean, I do like it, and I think the aerial kind of view, I think, helps make sense of the project in a way that the other drawings don't really do. But I think the fragmented nature of it, to me, comes across most clearly in view from 2F deck exterior rendering. It's like a couple images before that. Yeah, that one. And what I mean by that is, like, look at all the window types that you have. You know, look at the way that handrails butt into glass. Look at the way that the roof slab don't match. There's little walls jutting out from the skin, you know. And I think, like, it's that drawing right there, to me, tells me that there's a lot of things happening in here that need resolution. And I know that in a project of a semester length of this scale with this much depth, it's hard to wrangle all that into, like, clarity and cohesion and semblance. But I would take some cues from this drawing because, you know, like I said, in Bruno's, you know, the drawing is like a mirror, right? And so this is reflecting to me that there are a lot of unresolved, relatively simple moves that can be addressed to really clarify the project, I think, conceptually and from a cohesion standpoint. But then also, you know, talking about fragment again, each drawing type is a fragment, so to speak. And if you can start to think about drawings and different drawings as telling a much larger story than that one drawing is able to tell, you can start to think about how different drawings do things differently. And in conjunction, they try to describe the totality of the work. So, you know, that brings us to Hegel, you know, that not all things are possible in a given medium. And if you've worked with me in the past, you probably heard me say something like that before. But what it means is that we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and architects are really good at using a lot of different drawing styles and types. And you want to take advantage of what drawings are able to convey what information, and then using each of those to be critical of the work to develop it for further progress. But I think the fragmented nature of the work is most evident, at least in this drawing. I think that there's a strategy, and a kind of an urban strategy, that's a little clearer, even if the siting might be misappropriated, you know, something like that. But, you know, I would just do some careful analysis of the visuals and then start to make some adjustments. And I'll probably do some of those for the portfolio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Eve, you're muted if you're talking.
Yes, with a mic, much better with a mic. I said, thank you for the presentation. I'm a little bit perplexed by one thing. And if I misunderstood the context, please tell me. You mentioned the peninsula-like junction from your circulation diagrams. I was expecting a sort of busy area, or at least a complex area with a complex system of circulation between pedestrian vehicles, etc. And so I was expecting this building, in addition to its shape and the resolution of its program, I was expecting it to be a sort of urban catalyst, or maybe just at the crossroads at this intersection, but to be a sort of catalyst. And pictures which I see have nothing to do with what you promise or announce. And I see a building in almost something of a ghost town. There's nothing happening on the streets in your representations, and just a few pedestrians. But I miss one of the elements which I felt, but maybe I misunderstood it, was part of your intentions, that of being a sort of crystal-shaped things, reorganizing giving a sort of logic or density to the area, and it's just a sort of island in the middle of an empty sea. Is it just a question of representation? Did I miss out something? Did I misunderstand you? But I feel it seems to me terribly lonely, your building, whereas it should be at the heart of a busy system.
I believe like when we described the site as a peninsula-like junction, we intended to use that site to create a building of prominence and like an institutional feel, and that's what we strive to do for our building. Yeah.
Okay, I'm almost the only one of the few here who don't know the context, so blame it on me.
I will say the one description of the building and this desire for an institutional feel, I hang on that a little bit. I've actually been avoiding, every time you say it, I kind of just am like, I think it's a mistake that you're saying it, but it's a funny description to me, but I don't have anything else to say. It's just a little funny.
Okay.
So I would say, I mean, if you just are looking, you know, with the sort of a non-specific way at the renderings of this sort of actually luminous glass box, right, of various luminosities. To me, the whole thing, at least, and as you've shown it in some of the major representations, looks completely institutional, exactly to your point, and more like it's a gallery building or a museum. So for me, that representation doesn't also meet the requirements of thinking about, you know, the messiness within of the studios, right, or the residences and so forth. So, you know, I looked at the rendering, I thought, oh, it's Richard Meyer in Beverly Hills, you know, which I don't, and I don't mean to disparage it in that regard, but that's how I, you know, sort of reacted to it. So I just wonder, you know, in terms of these discussions of representation, you know, thinking about, so it's a beautiful box for showing art, but what about how's making art represented and living as an artist who makes art?
It does have, like, if you want to call it institutional, like Fumiko Maki did the MIT Design Lab building. It's also quite kind of informal as well with screens on it. Sure, maybe in that regard, but yeah, I'm still, from a scale, for a variety of reasons, suspect of that, but maybe that's a reference point. That also has kind of living studios in it of sorts, design lab stuff.
Blame the institutional on me.
Got you.
I think it just comes down to, I think it just comes down to how the screens are rendered, really. It would change the look of the building if they were accurately rendered. It would look more unified. And I think that you'd have had to address some of the issues that arise with doing a screen around the whole facade, like cutting openings into it and things like that where it's appropriate. So I don't know if it was, if you tried rendering it different ways and didn't like how it was being represented, if it was shown darker and more opaque like it would actually be. But I think that you know, it would clean it up formally to have the screens actually be accurately rendered.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Any other final comments on this project? Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Hong. We're going to move on to the next project.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, how y'all doing? Do we make sure that it's going through the slides properly, Ella? Oh yeah. Can you see that? Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, perfect. So my name is Mary Helen Porter and my partner is Ella Jacobs. And the title of our project is Living and Working Intertwined, Designing for Wellness in Post-COVID Cities.
So in our studio, we were asked to consider contemporaneity's impact on design and what that means for our own design. Contemporaneity provokes thought and in itself is a question. In connection with architecture, contemporaneity asks the designer to search for form when no form is given or search for precedent when no formal precedent is given. However, in terms of our studio, contemporaneity asks us to consider architecture and historic context with regards to our stretch of Magazine Street, which is between Jackson Avenue and the interstate. So over this past year, the pandemic amplified many issues present in the urban fabric of New Orleans. And having a site in a historic and preserved city lends way to investigating and testing various contemporary architectural interventions.
So in response to our studio brief, we wanted to explore how this pandemic has political dimensions in this historic setting. A main issue that was amplified this past year was how the relationship between where we live and work changed overnight. As remote work increases, even past COVID, the functionality of urban domestic life must change. And as designers, we wanted to address this sudden shift architecturally in the context of Magazine Street, as it is clear it is becoming an issue in dense areas across the world. The specificity or identity of Magazine Street was considered in the project primarily through how private and public green spaces are utilized. From the beginning, we knew that a diversity of private balconies, and shared courtyards would be a crucial part of our project and drive the spatial organization of private offices, residential spaces, and shared programs in our mixed-use project. And as we developed our project, we also realized that while this project is site-specific, it actually could be replicated or considered in other contexts or cities.
And so in order to consider how workspaces could be designed with these things in mind, we began studying the historical shifts in office design at large, just while considering how housing and access to housing brought us to where we are today. So as the timeline which you've previously seen plays in the background, we wanted to focus on the historical implications of office design in juxtaposition to the history of housing, with a consideration for how we critique past designs in order to surmise what the future of live-work design holds for the future. And so with the onset of the pandemic, some workplace design critics are predicting the return of cubicles in order to enforce social distancing and calling for a pause on the open office plan in favor of a permanent working from home solution. However, taking into consideration the historical and design implications, which you have seen about workplace trends, human factors in design, and the potential for technology to impact where and how we work, there's actually a much more positive approach we can see from stepping back and looking forward to the future of live workspaces post-COVID. So the global pause caused by the pandemic has given designers the ability to reinvent workplaces by combining best elements of the past with the promise of the future to give us healthier and more dynamic workplaces. So through these maps, we mainly wanted to highlight the divide between large workspaces and offices on one half of the interstate, which you'll see in the CBD and warehouse district, in contrast to our half of the site, which is mainly residential with a few smaller office spaces scattered throughout Magazine Street. Of course, we do hope to mix individual office spaces within this highly residential area just to combine them.
So from the start, we recognized how important it was to have private and shared outdoor spaces. So we knew we needed to choose a larger site. And this lot is a decent size and enabled us to create diversity in public and private spaces for the residents to live and work in. This is also where residential spaces start to collide with warehouses and structures oriented towards production. So we thought it would also be an interesting site for exploring the intersection of live workspaces.
So in terms of zoning, we are in the historic urban neighborhood district, just meaning it is mixed use commercial space that prioritizes pedestrian access. So our site is fairly large at 180 by 160 square feet.
So the main variance we would be applying for is parking. Our region is located in an area where the percentage of people with no vehicle is actually greater than the New Orleans average of 18.4%. So a large percentage of the people in this area use public transit, they bike or they walk compared to other areas of the city. The city would require 48 parking spaces based on the quantity of office and residential units that are part of our project. Right now, there are 11 spaces available on Melpomene and Magazine Street, and we would provide 13 spaces in our building. So we would need to apply for a variance for the other 24 spaces. While there are some parking spaces for the residents on our project, we wanted to focus on other spaces that build a specific live-work environment on site.
So based on our design framework, our program focuses on intersections between the live-work model. Amenities included for residents were also chosen to promote healthy balances between living and working. And so our initial aggregation process was based on designing these individual units first. The residential units are fairly large at 1,800 square feet, while the studio and office spaces are 950 square feet. And both the residential units and the office units include private balconies. And these dimensions were what our initial iterations were just based off of.
Yeah, so as Ella just mentioned, we did use those dimensions of the unit floor plans to do some parametric design work iterations, which you can see above. And we found that pinwheeling plans were actually successful in creating private spaces for private balconies, which were included into the shapes we were working with. And so those final iterations are shown below. And then this is a spatial diagram or a diagram that shows the different private and public outdoor spaces as well as indoor spaces on the 3 floors.
And so just exploring this structure, we wanted to diagram just a very fairly simple structural layout where we wanted to explore similar points and support. This is our site plan. So while we could have designed up to the lot line, we decided to keep the corner lot open to welcome a pedestrian in. The ground floor has private offices with direct access to green spaces, and these offices could be used by the residents or rented out to people in the community. The rest of the ground floor houses additional programs for the residents. And currently, as Mary Helen mentioned earlier, we are offering 13 parking spaces in our building property with 11 off and on-street spots. So what's interesting is that this site used to be a premium parking lot space, which is currently in the process of being demolished. So as the site has plenty of free off and on-street parking, our building would offer ride-sharing opportunities, encouraging people to use Magazine Street for walking and biking to nearby spaces or their office within the building rather than driving.
So from the ground floor, communal spaces transition up to the 2nd floor where there are also residential and private office units. And then on the 3rd floor, it's primarily residential units and private office units with a large communal balcony that actually cantilevers over the corner. And then our roof plan shows there's more green spaces and a track for exercising.
And so for our section perspectives, we just wanted to emphasize the courtyards and combinations of live-work spaces, as well as communal programs on each floor. So we'll see here.
So the specificity of Magazine Street was also considered through our material choices. On Magazine Street, residential homes primarily use wood, while commercial spaces can be found using wood, brick, or stone. So we decided to primarily use wood as cladding on the 2nd and 3rd floors where the residential units are, and stone on the ground floor where there are no residential units.
So you can only approach the site as a pedestrian with this view, and this also became a part of our political framework as we prioritize the pedestrian view versus what a vehicle would see. So this first render is just showing the ground floor with those open office spaces into the courtyard. And then this is one of the amenities that we provide in the back, which is just this rock climbing area.
So you can see here, this is a private balcony looking onto Magazine Street. So you can see the private balconies in relationship to the contextual ones. And then this is from the pet park on the 3rd floor looking into the project.
So this is the view from Magazine Street going west, which is what a vehicle would see going down the one-way.
And with this view, we're showcasing how we opened up the corner to the public. And again, since this is a one-way street, this is from the pedestrian's point of view. And then this is a more realistic image of how the project might look in the site.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's jumping in?
I'll just jump in, I guess. There's a lot of really cool stuff in here, and it's a really nice project, and you've really developed a lot of kind of sensitivity to like a wide variety of things. And one thing I'm wondering about though is, I think it struck me most in the diagrams page, where you're looking at like the 5 different programmatic types. And what it seemed like to me in first glance at that diagram was it might be well served to think of that as having an organizational logic, because what seems to be lacking a little bit is like a stronger overarching intelligibility of a formal system or a formal logic to the project. And I think you can still get the exuberance of the forms that you're creating, but you could still do so with a clear and consistent sort of organizational strategy. Because then when I look down at the plans, then I start to think, what is there a grid that could be gleaned that could give me like a structural logic to this? It looks like a lot of different buildings, on one hand, but it's just something to be aware of, I think, when you're working on the premise of the project. But I want to pick up on this idea of contemporaneity also, because I think that's a really compelling idea and suggestion of the studio, and I'm wondering really what it means to be contemporary. I think oftentimes we think about architecture as being visionary, and I think we oftentimes also hear like that's a contemporary project or that's being contemporary. But I wonder what the goal of being contemporary is. And on one hand, architecture, I think, does rely on sort of forward thinking about 30, 40 years into the future in some ways too. So are we talking about a contemporary that isn't here yet? Or are we talking about a contemporary that is of this time and place? Or what really is contemporary? And it makes me think of a statement I had heard on thesis reviews, I believe, by Jeff Kipnis a number of years ago. And he said something to the effect of, it's not just what you do, but it's as much sometimes when you do what you do. And that you can think about that in a lot of different ways. You can think about it materially, you can think about it culturally, socially, politically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you want to be aware of the contexts that you're critiquing and then reestablishing or restitching. And so, I think there's a difference between contemporary and visionary, and I want to know more about what that means to all of you when you're working.
Yeah, I think we started out the semester we kind of chose this topic early on. And I think that it's definitely evolved over the semester and how, like from the beginning, it felt very almost reactionary to what's happening. Because, I mean, at the beginning of the year, nobody really expected a year ago, nobody really expected a global pandemic. And like planning for that architecturally, I guess, wasn't really happening. So I think that it's been interesting developing this project with like starting it out feeling pretty reactionary, but actually starting to think about how the live-work dynamic might change and how to like design with that in mind.
Yeah, can you point to the most, like, one thing I think about sometimes too on reviews or presentations is like, what's the through line? And if that sounds like your through line on the project, sort of reimagining the live work sort of lifestyle in a post-pandemic environment. And can you point to where that exists most sort of transparently in the project?
Yeah, I think that
specific drawing,
section. Yeah, either section or in plan. I think it's maybe that one or a plan. I think just how we arrange the residential units with the private offices and then the communal space, those 3 different elements. Like we've tried to really intertwine them all, but still have kind of a logic for each floor. So that might show here with the different types of spaces.
Yeah.
Maybe I would like to jump on Benjamin's comments. You have no freedom without rules, and I don't really see the rules for your freedom to happen. Like, I'm just willing to focus very carefully and try to find out, okay, what are the logics and how can we end up into this kind of almost forced metabolism of live-work condition, and what are the outcome? And a part of that, I think it's an interesting move and it has a lot of potential, but I wonder precisely from a more monotonous architecture where you have different layers of mixity and simpler solution, what is actually the precise additional value and qualities you can propose in terms of relating the living and work all together. Because I see in your floor plan a lot of areas related and dedicated to distribution, and I don't know how and what you will do there. So I feel that I think it has a lot of good intuitions, but it sounds like the logic and the rule needs to be clearer for us to buy it. I mean, I personally think it's what I feel like. Maybe I'm too rational in general, but that's possibly the reason why.
I do think it's an interesting comment about, I think you just said, Clement, forced metabolism or metabolic architecture, whatever. I think that's an interesting point, especially if you think about then this idea of contemporary whatever. Everyone should always be thinking about what is contemporary and why are we why the hell are we so focused on making contemporary architecture, and what the hell does it mean at this point? There's a lot of loaded crap in it in some ways, but that's interesting. So to the forced metabolic thing, to me, it makes me think about like the analysis of loft living that occurred. I'm not sure who did it at this point, but it was post-analysis of how artists occupied lofts in the 60s in New York. And also like and really that becomes analysis of industrial architecture in Soho, Manhattan, which is those buildings were designed as printing presses. All the architect did was design the cast iron facade. The structure was super simple, super basic. And then that gets us into kind of the skin architecture of 30 years ago, 20 years ago. So simple open plan grid, design the skin. I think this idea of freedom and choice and all that is very interesting, and especially how it relates to us as architects, and especially possibly in a COVID thing. I think that question about what is the freedom in this project is very important. And is metabolic architecture free? Or did we just force all the algorithms on us already? All the decisions are made, or do the people make the decisions? That's perpetually a question we're asked, meaning do we design a factory that is very generic and can be post-occupied, or do we specify it all out the gate? And to me, this spiraling pinwheel, which is provocative, pinwheels are beautiful, I love talking about them, but is that creating freedom? And what is your stance on that? Generic versus specific?
I think in general, we tried to have we started out with like pretty strict rules when we were doing our iterations, but got pretty loose on them towards the end as I guess we were putting like the puzzle pieces together, and which I kind of thought was beneficial because it allowed for, I think, different types of spaces, like the unit plans and the like the residential and office unit plans look they're all like pretty modular and the same, but when it came to putting them together, I think that it created a lot of different types of spaces. I don't know if that answers your question.
And just one last thing, one detail, if I may, while on the subject of freedom, I mean, give some freedom to freedom. You cannot always, how do I put it? define or shape freedom at the risk of losing it. Just one example, but which will be a metaphor for what we mean. Do you really expect anyone to use and jog on the running track which you put on the rooftop? No one will. Go to the pinnacle at Duxton, and over there you have sort of floating at the 17th floor. You have a very long running track meandering through the buildings. There you can run. Here, I mean, you can't have two vents like 1 meter away from another. I mean, people will get dizzy before the end of it. I mean, it's good that you suggest that there can be a sort of free space, free use, create opportunities for reshaping ourselves, our uses of things. But defining a shape sometimes is dangerous. You should find the right balance between suggesting, making things possible, which is a very difficult thing to do, and making them impossible by not stopping just in time before it's too late. Allow something to happen. Sometimes the moment you give a shape to it, you design it, and you block the system, and then you're fucked. Oh, excuse my French. Then you get into trouble. Find the right balance. Sometimes it's very good to just drop the pen just in time and let things happen. Sometimes it pays to be constructively and fruitfully lazy or reasonable.
Yeah, I think that the idea of freedom is it's a kind of loaded term. You have to kind of define what one means by freedom. You know, I suspect when you say freedom in this project, you mean freedom to place the elements within it, you know, kind of loosely associate them, and that there's some flexibility in where they could be located. But to do that without understanding the logic, or without understanding a structural system behind it, it kind of turns freedom into I don't know. You know, there's freedom. How do I explain this? There's freedom, and then there's like the kind of freedom that you know, results in people, you know, breathing on you during the time of COVID, right? Like that kind of freedom. Like, yeah, I'm free to do whatever I want. Well, personal freedom. I feel like you need this needs a little bit of discipline in terms of how these pieces go together, and how what would be the kind of underlying structural system that would, if you had made choices like that, I think you would find that you would have more freedom, because you would have less freedom to put these things wherever you want. You would be able to have a lot of freedom within a system. But I still think I'm still waiting to see that system. I don't quite see it yet. And I think in the next phase, you'd really want to think about how these things work together, these units work together within a structure, or as a structure.
I think
sorry.
No, please. Sorry.
I really enjoyed the presentation, really articulated. The drawings are really clean and clear, beautiful. I think that that theme of live and work is an important one. And I wonder if, I mean, all these comments about flexibility are to the point in my view. The place where I see the project moving further, if you can put the floor plan, is more sophistication in the way you think about inside spaces. You know, the distributions you're making with living, dining, kitchen, and bedrooms might be rigid in a way. So perhaps in a contemporary way, thinking about pieces that move during the day and the night, also pieces that are isolated in terms of sound, or even the possibility of escaping from the main entrance to another entrance. All these kind of sort of small things with doors, furniture, all these things can make a unit of this size able to accommodate working people in different times, like kids and parents, etc., with domestic life. I think that the point is to stress a little bit more the distribution or the organization of functions during the day, you know, like having a clear, showing how flexible that can be over time to the different scenarios that might come up in a normal, you know, life of a week, and making that possible in a good way.
Maybe also, I think the question of the project, the way it can force the analytical approach to a system could be super beneficial. And I think, you know, it can end up with a question of prefab, of reversibility, or like, what if everybody wants to work? What if everybody wants to leave? What if, like, it can add things? It sounds like it has to offer additional options. So we see the power of your project. It has a lot of good ideas, but it sounds like it needs some rationals behind it.
I was just going to add that it seemed like from the early diagrams that there was an effort to make this like on a micro scale an urban planning project by treating each space almost like it's an individual box or structure. And I think that's where you get some of this diversity of spaces that you see in these, you know, extremely wide circulation corridors and the kind of fragmented exterior space that's both public and semi-public. But I think that like cities evolve over time, and some of those interesting juxtapositions aren't something that you can create. And so I think that that's kind of the theme of everyone's comments, are figuring out a way to make this building and these spaces be a destination rather than just the space between, you know, two programmed elements, because there's a potential here for a lot of these spaces to end up being kind of dead, unprogrammed exterior spaces, when you could create more of a nucleus to the project that makes the organizational principles more clear.
I want to go back to a comment, Ben Smith, you did it a little bit earlier about the question of contemporaneity in architecture, and you opposed it somewhat to visionary. Was it, or was that?
Yeah. I mean, I just, you know, contemporary, visionary. You know, is there a difference?
Well, yeah, to me, maybe there is one, or maybe we should make one, because I think contemporary is any, you know, technically you can say any building that is done today is a contemporary. The question is how you define contemporary. And there is a spectrum there. And this is why the question of identity and specificity, I introduced them to the studio because I think they are important. And when you think of the question of identity, I understand identity as something that evolves over time, where people think of identity a lot of times as something that is static. So when you intervene in a context, and this is why, you know, the studio is placed in a historic context, the question is how you define the identity of a place, and what is contemporary and what is contextual. is the identity of place, let's say Magazine Street, and specifically the context of this project here is the houses around it, and this is how you define what you should intervene and how you can be contemporary in that context. I mean, the question of, contextual also become very interesting. Previously, on a previous review in the studio, we had the project of Gary in Bilbao came up, and the question of, a lot of people consider it non-contextual, where the argument was that it is a very, it is a very contextual building. People misread it as not contextual, but if you understand the project, if you understand the process of the design, even if formally it doesn't belong to the immediate context, it is a very contextual building. So how can you come up with a project or any project that you're building today, how you define the specificity and the identity of the place will help you in defining what is contextual, whether your project is contextual or not, and how you define that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you reminded me of one of my favorite descriptions of being contextual, and I think it actually relates very well to being contemporary as well. And it was, a dozen years ago or so, maybe 15 years ago, when I saw a Koolhaas lecture at Columbia. I think I mentioned this to you before, Amar, but he was talking about CCTV, and it had just been completed. And somebody in the audience was asking, well, how is this contextual at all? And they were talking about like the formal sensibility of a vernacular, something to that effect.
Right.
And Koolhaas's response was pretty brilliant. He said, it's absolutely contextual. It's the only place in the world where I could build it. And he meant socially, politically, economically. Yeah. And it wasn't about the formal disposition at all. That was what it could be, but what it, where it could happen at that moment was absolutely contextual. And so I think that there's a lot of ways to conceive of context and being contemporary. And I think they do go hand in hand, actually, because being contextual in 1950 versus being contextual in 2020, 2022, whatever it may be, radically different, And so I think it's just important to know which conversation you're participating in, like which things matter and what things get ratcheted up or down or dialed up and dialed back to sort of speak to those conversations. And I think that has to go with the through line, what I was mentioning earlier. And so like if the through line is about being contemporary or having contemporaneity as an aspect of the work, what's the subject matter of the contemporary context, that's being addressed? Is it form? Is it material? Is it siting? Is it urbanism? It can be any of that stuff. And I think the studio is set up to sort of take on any one of those challenges, honestly. And I think that's a testament to the diversity of the work that we're seeing so far. So yeah, I think it's a really important conversation.
But this is where, the question of specificity to me is different from identity. And if we're talking about a specificity, let's say of New Orleans, is the climatic issues that we are facing. Building in New Orleans is very different from building in, let's say in Arizona or other areas. So that is something that is part of the specificity of the place, and it doesn't evolve as much as the identity. But if you look at the identity of New Orleans or Magazine Street in the last 100 years, it evolved and it changed. So you can look at that. A lot of times people look at the place at a specific time and say, well, this is the identity of the place, and we want to keep that identity, where the truth is identity is not as something as set as people think of it, especially in architecture.
And sorry,
Amar, it's Carol. If I could just interrupt, I'd actually like to change I know we have to go on, but I think Megan's comment is one of the most interesting I've heard in this, talking about this as an urban planning It's a building. It's a little world unto itself as an urban plan. And speaking of specificity and flexibility, it makes me wonder, and I would ask both Mary Helen and Ella and you, Amar, whether, it seems to me that maybe the fixed pieces of this building are the communal spaces. And then how flexible can all these spaces be around them such that they might change completely over time? A residence might become a workspace, 3 or 4 workspaces might be cobbled together to make a residence. How can you think that flexibility into this design, but with the decision that you might make these communal spaces your fixed points of reference? Anyway, I just wanted to interject that because I thought Megan's comment was really spot on.
Agreed. And I'm sure we this is a great segue to the next project, so we can go ahead and move to the next presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Reed Campbell. My partner is Midge Bishop, and as a kind of a disclaimer before I share my screen, our project takes a different approach to the studio than those presented thus far. Rather than focusing on one contemporary design in the historic setting of Magazine Street in this corridor, we were more interested in creating a theoretical framework in which any contemporary design in a historic setting could be realized. This presented challenges and was different not only in the work produced, but presented challenges in the way we presented our project to the guest panels throughout the semester. Partly because we're being forced to present virtually, and partly because we chose to apply the theoretical framework that we developed to 2 sites. And so always presenting these sites side by side in comparison and conversation with each other was a little bit limiting with a typical slide presentation. So this is a long way of saying that we've in the past few weeks experimented with and found that pre-recorded video was the best way to present our site with precision, or excuse me, our project with precision and clarity. So I'm going to play the video, and then at the end have PDF ready to go where we can, scroll through any of the drawings that we need to, or we can scroll through any of the still frames of the video if that's helpful as well.
This project is intended to be a framework using 2 sites along the historic Magazine Street corridor as variables. Our goal is to analyze and study the process of finding answers to the questions of contemporaneity and context presented in the studio using design as a means to an end as opposed to an end itself. This framework considers an existing historic site's context and identity to determine a contemporary response on a spectrum that defines contemporaneity through context. Our designs are influenced by those placements as well as by the political dimensions we found intrinsic to each site. We have 2 sites that have similar specificities in that they are geographically close on Magazine Street in New Orleans, but have dramatically different identities and immediate contexts that would elicit 2 differing responses to contemporaneity. Our designs for each site are shown here and illustrate that differing response to contemporaneity.
After selecting 2 sites that have clear present-day contrasts, we began studying the history of the built form of each, utilizing Sanborn maps. Site A includes the historic St. Vincent's Orphanage, originally built in 1864 with a major renovation and addition completed in 1996. We found it important to maintain this landmark in our design. The built history of Site B, since at least the 1890s, contained a series of temporary warehouse structures, and the block itself was altered when the interstate was built. This was the first major difference we studied between the 2 sites, and it was a major influence in our decision to examine 2 sites in parallel, 2 sites that share the specificity of a geographic location within New Orleans, but significantly different identities. Site A has a clear and meaningful architectural history and has an identity that includes temporary residences
in varying forms. Due to its proximity to the river, port, and much later the interstate, the industrial identity of Site B prevails even if the industrial structures upon the site were more temporary in nature. Our understanding of the contemporary in an historical context was influenced by an article published by Riza and Doratli in the Journal of Architectural and Planning Research, in which they develop a continuum through which to view contemporary interventions in historical settings. Refined and updated for the research of this studio, this contextual continuum places designs on a spectrum from contextual uniformity to non-contextual juxtaposition. With contextual uniformity, the central concern is maintaining the continuity of the existing local character, which is achieved through imitating a place's visual and/or spatial character. Contextual continuity interprets the historic context through a contemporary lens, taking reference from the historic style using its own contemporary architectural language. Contextual juxtaposition displays harmony through contrast and is achieved through a contrasting appearance created by using new materials, shapes, forms, or heights. Non-contextual juxtaposition is a style that seeks to create iconic architecture without much regard to context, aided by new digital tools in the field. These buildings could often be anywhere and still look the same. We should stress here that this is a continuum, and as the name implies, it continues in both directions. This continuum is meant to suggest that it is a rare project that would be the perfect distillation of either extreme. Thus, while Peter Cook's Graz Art Museum is closer to non-contextual juxtaposition than Renzo Piano's Morgan Library, we are not at all suggesting that the Graz Art Museum is entirely acontextual or without any regard to context. The precise location of a project on the continuum is less important than the overall disposition that each approach takes with regard to the historic setting.
Site A's strong architectural history pulled its design between contextual continuity and contextual juxtaposition. We believe the best design choices revolved around complementing St. Vincent's Orphanage and the character of that block. Aesthetic decisions needed to be carefully thought out and needed to result in a relatively natural continuation of St. Vincent's Orphanage. Site B's amorphous and transient architectural history pushed its design process between contextual juxtaposition and non-contextual juxtaposition. The industrial nature of this block next to the interstate led to bold political statements and allowed for interpretive aesthetic choices. Analysis of the context of each site, as well as consideration of political dimensions, allowed us to determine the place along the continuum that a contemporary intervention at each site would be best suited to address such issues.
Our analysis of each site continued with the materiality study using pictures from each site. At Site A, we compared the materiality of the site as a whole to the materiality of the historic building itself. You can also see from photos of the site, St. Vincent's large presence on the street and documentation of its current renovation into a boutique hotel.
For Site B, we found that most buildings on site were brick and then explored any other different types of materiality on site that we found. We also took some time to notice the current juxtaposition of industrial materials like telephone poles and wires that are alongside plants and natural elements. Photos from Site B highlight its industrial nature and proximity to the interstate. Addressing the existing site allowed us to understand context fully and continue to push our sites into their respective frameworks. The existing site's materiality studies inspired our overall ideas for our political statements and the design process.
An analysis of each urban vicinity and areas surrounding each site helped us to arrive at the appropriate intervention. Conditions such as siting and massing, scale and proportion, rhythm and materiality, as well as surrounding programs were determinative in our contemporary approach to each context. Additionally, we looked at the scale and proportion of buildings in the surrounding area for each site, taking note of the large heights of St. Vincent's constructed before modern zoning ordinances on Site A, as well as the interstate in close proximity to Site B.
Phase 2 includes our political dimensions. Contemporaneity in an historic context is not simply about responding to the visual built environment. We believe that any approach to contemporaneity must address pressing political issues of its day and that any aesthetic response is inherently political. As such, each site brought to the fore political issues that required programmatic and formal responses. The primary political dimension of Site B was to create a noticeable building to be an aesthetic representation of climate change and our estranged relationship with nature in an urban environment as exemplified by this block. We wanted to respond to that context with a building that was both organic and rectilinear in form, aesthetically representing that disharmonious relationship.
Tourism is vital to the economy of New Orleans, but the balance between supporting that economy and maintaining the unique character of individual neighborhoods that contribute to the identity of New Orleans is a delicate one. And it is a balance that has increasingly favored converting historic properties into short-term rentals, often at the expense of local residents. We believe that halting the renovation of St. Vincent's Orphanage into a boutique hotel allows the site to be developed in a manner that better addresses the needs of the neighborhood.
A significant commonality of our sites is an interpretation of green public space through each site's lens of contemporaneity. Site A has an open lot next to the building that we plan to use as a traditional green public space and potential sculpture garden, in line with Site A's placement on the contextual continuum. This is a traditional and contextual interpretation of green space that is easy to envision at this location. Site B has public space on the roof that is accessible both from the outside and inside the building. The green component of this green public space is a terraced roof garden, and there are designated seating areas carved into it. This is a non-traditional interpretation of a green public space and stands in stark contrast to the traditional green public space of Site A.
Halting the development into a boutique hotel requires a programmatic response. We believe that St. Vincent's can become an institution, a collective of local artists and gig workers, a place that provides space for creative production in designated studios, space to exhibit this work in a contemporary edition, and space to live alongside other creatives in residences on the upper floors of the existing buildings.
We wanted to make sure this building was striving for sustainable harm reduction in material selection. We chose to use recycled glass bricks as exterior facades in all directions, demonstrating potential uses for recycled glass. This political dimension has also influenced our program. We chose to create an ecological center and designate exhibit space to a small-scale glass recycling center meant to draw attention to glass recycling and reuse in a city that does not recycle glass. Our other spaces are meant for temporary educational exhibits and to be an unusual spatial experience with curved walls or ceilings and glass brick walls that partially distort light.
As we moved into the more formal design phase, every decision was made in light of the theoretical framework of the contextual continuum and built upon previous levels of analysis. The continuum aspect of our framework became reinforced as each decision had the potential to move each design slightly in one direction or another along the continuum. But each intervention remained rooted in the initial contextual approach.
Site A's iterative process was slow and careful. We kept St. Vincent's and the immediate context of the site in mind and chose to reflect and respond to that. The Site B iterations were quick and varied, pushing Site B further towards the non-contextual juxtaposition segment of the contextual continuum.
As with other design decisions, the massings for each design were approached from the position on the contextual continuum that each site called for. With the presence of the historic buildings of St. Vincent's, the initial approach focused on how the existing buildings engage and communicate with each other through the use of outdoor galleries, and rethinking that communication with a contemporary connection, which is later scaled up to engage the open space to one side of the site, as well as to frame the entrance to St. Vincent's. Site B's approach was focused on identifying the buildable volume and creating organic shapes within that respond to the political and programmatic needs that previous analysis helped to determine. The final step for each site was to incorporate open public green space, whether it be in the form of a traditional neighborhood park or a terraced green roof.
Materiality for both sites plays a crucial role in its placement on the contextual continuum. Site A is dominated by the large brick facade of St. Vincent's, and our contemporary intervention is juxtaposed by a light, mostly glass facade building that becomes contextual with a metal shading screen that is in direct communication with the prominent wrought iron railings of the porch and balcony of St. Vincent's. Our main materiality choice for B included recycled glass brick. It functions as harm reduction in materiality, as well as being a contemporary interpretation of the brick used in the surrounding context. These renders further demonstrate how these buildings are placed on the contextual continuum.
By comparing two sites within the same historic corridor of Magazine Street in New Orleans, we were able to develop a theoretical framework through which concrete design decisions could be made. Decisions such as siting, massing, and materiality. Decisions that required formal and programmatic responses to contemporary political issues. The value in the contextual continuum is in its lack of prescriptive design criteria and in its embrace of descriptive qualities of contemporary interventions in historic settings.
Thank you.
Can you please define, you used a couple words that I think really need clarification. You said you wanted to respond to the needs of the neighborhood in taking the boutique hotel out and putting this kind of creative institutional piece there instead. I think you need to define the needs of the neighborhood, and you need to define why this little creative, in quote, colony helps at all with any needs, and that's a capital N. And then also you defined the political occasionally, and I do think as architects, if we're to be professionals and we try to be so multidisciplinary and that we understand all these very complex things and then come up with formal solutions, we have to understand what is political and what is the word politic. And so I think you need to define to us what you see as political, and you need to define needs, because the politic defines the need, or vice versa. The politics can control your needs. So politics is a tool, and it comes at a collision of all these scenarios. But you need to define for us very clearly what the needs of the neighborhood are and why your creative thing is solving that. And you need to define to us what politics are in your construct.
Sorry, I just want to add something here. Politics and political are different to me.
Okay, good.
Okay, and there's policies, obviously, which is, again, something else. In French, it's much easier because, you know, le politique et la politique, if it's feminine or masculine, you're talking about one versus the other, and the distinction is maybe a bit easier. But very often, you know, political and politics are used interchangeably, but they are different.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, great.
Otherwise, I see this just as a formal exploration, I should say. And that's why I want the clarification, because otherwise I don't understand any of the programming stuff.
Right. So I think I'll take a stab at this. I think the political, which is what we were kind of talking about rather than politics, is at least the way that we understand it. The kind of in the tradition of Jacques Rancière, like the aesthetic is political. And so that's why we think that even the formal moves that we make are political moves. So that's why we say we respond, or we identify the political dimensions and we respond to them both programmatically and formally. And I think that's sometimes often a thing that's maybe not agreed upon in architecture or not focused on, is the idea that the aesthetic is political. In terms of the needs of of the neighborhood. I do think that perhaps I agree with the criticism that perhaps we could explain those better or identify those better, and further analysis could be done to identify that. I think, you know, as we initially approached Site A, our response tended to focus more on the formal response, and you've kind of recognized that. Because we have this kind of historic building that we want to respond to, we felt that there was a formal response that was kind of predominant over a programmatic response, right? So I think the program is a little undeveloped, you know, if I'm being to critique our own project, you know, whereas in Site B, the program might be a little bit more developed or more thought out in terms of its responding to its vicinity or whatever.
I was just going to add with the program stuff, like I almost think it would have been more interesting to have the program of the like non-contextual juxtaposition project be something more mundane, and how and why does it have that type of formal response, whereas, you know, you could have done something more inventive with the one that had a more contextual response. I think that might have set up for a more kind of interesting design challenge, because the Site B definitely becomes signage in a sense for the underlying idea that you're trying to communicate. Like you're trying to draw attention to it in order to draw attention to a larger social issue. So I think that with that, it just kind of becomes a one-liner in that way. And it could have been the program selection there might have complemented the formal response in a way that was more interesting.
I'll just add to the kind of the program of Site A with St. Vincent's. The idea, part of the reason that we kind of arrived at this idea of creating a space for exhibiting art and producing art, it was kind of, we took one of the precedents we looked at was, or two actually, in Houston. One, the Menil Institute, and also Project Row Houses, both of which kind of are, well, Project Row Houses, which is much more interested in kind of socially engaged, socially practiced art. And then the Menil Institute, which creates a kind of art institute within a neighborhood that's kind of very contextual, but contemporary, like scale-wise, very contextual, respects the kind of neighborhood, the fabric of the neighborhood, and is, you know, free, open institution to anyone that wants to come. So it was kind of, in that way, it was intended to be in that vein, and in that way is also political.
Why does, like, I just have to keep on that. Would you say the Menil is political in that regard? Like, I like that you talk about the Menil. I do want to know a little bit why you think that is political. Why are we wrapping that into this architectural discussion?
Sure, I think.
And is it good enough to waste our time with it?
Sure, I think so. I tend to think that I'm reminded of something I've read for one of my classes here at Tulane by Pierre Bourdieu, and I think he makes the comment. I'm going to butcher it, or in the paraphrasing of it, but that art museums and institutions don't have to be kind of gatekeepers or enclaves for exclusion of classes or kind of the separation of classes. And I think that's something that the Menil Institute does. The opposite of that is that because of its free nature, it's kind of a social mixer. It brings people from all classes together, or it has the potential to, because it's free, and it has people that are very interested in arts, and it has people that live in the neighborhood or throughout Houston that are interested because it's a wonderful space to be, both at the building and the park surrounding it. So in that sense, I think the Menil is political.
But like, sure, I don't think that that this should be a discussion about, is something political. The Menil is political. Of course it's political. Of course it's political. It's how is it political? And on the one hand, you're telling me that the Menil is an open institution that is free to the public and has this, you're saying that's representative of its being an egalitarian institution, right?
Yes.
Okay, but it's also in one of the fancier neighborhoods in Houston. It's also in an architectural style that has no relationship to the rest of the city aside from its scale. I mean, it's not, that's hardly the architecture of working people. I mean, for me, the politics, if we want to talk about politics, the Manil is an elite institution, and it's a complete embodiment of our stratified society. It's not some egalitarian institution. I mean, I'm giving you a counter argument. So like this idea that there's kind of one political dimension to things is sort of, I think, a little maybe too simple. I think that we have to, I just don't understand how, I guess I'm having trouble with understanding how the Manil is a great example for this.
Agreed.
I just don't get it at all.
Again, it like I said, it was one of two examples that we looked at in Houston. One that is much more egalitarian in nature, the project row houses, which architect Teddy Cruz has been involved in as well. So I think, I mean, it wasn't just one, and it wasn't even, there are many precedents that we looked at, and it was, I guess, the idea of a neighbor, the reason I mentioned this because that idea of a neighborhood, something that's kind of in scale with the neighborhood, serves the neighborhood, the immediate surrounding, and is used by the neighborhood as a kind of a social space. That's all I meant by that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you want to, that there's, that I don't know, that wasn't clear to me. That's not, I think, and you got to kind of take a stand on this instead of using the term political in a kind of, I mean, everything, if everything's political, it's your job to define what you mean it very specifically by politics, or by what are the politics of these institutions that you're referring to? What is a political dimension that you see in these institutions, each of them, and the different political dimension in the Manil versus Project Row House? I mean, they couldn't, they are, to me, they're quite different. Sure. Ultimately, if you look at, I don't know how Project Row House is funded, but it might be interesting to look at that. There might be some overlap in terms of the two. Where
the Sacklers give them some money,
right?
Like, come on, let's get into it. Eat the potato.
Right.
Manils, how did the Manils make their money? Like, we all know this oil stuff. I mean, like, get it. Why are they in Houston?
Right.
Get into it. Breathe.
Right.
Did they take opioids? Breathe, man. Like, come on, this stuff is real. Art is funded. Art is funded by people for tax write-offs.
Right.
Get into it.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Have some passion. You have a brain. Art comes from places. It's weird. It's contradictory. The artists are often commenting about the donor. It is complicated. But if your project is political, you have to take it there. You have to ram it in there. It's so important. Or don't. Or do not. And do not mention it. Because you can't half mention it. We're not there anymore. We're in reality now. We've been taken there over the last few years. We have been taken there. So you must talk about it. You must be completely transparent. Who took the drugs? Who sucked the oil? How is it funded? That's why I'm staying quiet, but I'm wanting you to say it, but you will not say it. It's insane.
Can I just ask for a clarification on the which you feel like which side is doing which of the contextual responses is one? Because that one slide wasn't totally clear because it kind of pointed to being between contextual continuity and contextual juxtaposition. And then I guess site B being between juxtaposition or contextual juxtaposition and non-contextual. I'm just curious because I see the site B response, even though when you look at that kind of flat elevation, which oddly enough is like exactly how we would present something to the ARC if we were presenting it for review. You have to show that kind of flat contextual elevation. But it's when you look at the axon, there are parts of it that are responsive in that the front of the building comes down to the scale almost of the neighboring buildings. And then you have that arch entryway that looks more scaled appropriately to the adjacent context. I'm just curious, like, which of the moves do you identify with in both of the properties?
We really wanted to place these between each of these points on the spectrum because we didn't want to define it so clearly. For site B, I guess we really wanted to focus on juxtaposition and using those similar kind of very contextual, immediately contextual shapes, and then juxtapose it with something a little bit more out of the ordinary, which would push it towards non-contextual juxtaposition, but we didn't want to place it fully in that box. We mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation that it's difficult to place something fully in that box based on like interpretation or the intentions of the architect.
Yeah, and for site A, I think the massing operations is kind of where it tends more towards the continuity, and so rethinking kind of the connection of the two buildings and the circulation through the buildings was something that, you know, we did a lot of precedent study, and one we included up on the continuum was the Unterlinden Museum by Herzog and Dimmeron. And so one of the things they do in that project is kind of create a new entrance to the site, to the several buildings, rethink the circulation through it, and then create some additions. So that's kind of what we did there. And so having all these kind of precedents in mind of how they achieved where we think they are in the continuum, and what we could do with the massing operations or the iterations to kind of do something similar. And then with the materiality choices, we had kind of the idea of the Morgan Library in mind. So you can see there on the continuum, kind of this lighter building next to this kind of more massive building, and then maybe bringing it a little bit back more towards the continuity with kind of borrowing from the wrought iron railings and creating that metal screen.
What's the politics of a couple of, students or of like a couple of architects coming in and trying to interpret a context by, like adding flourishes that look like wrought iron? I mean, what are the politics of that?
Fair question.
I just want to say, I mean, I'm trying to follow and I'm trying to have my own frame of thinking, and I am a bit lost, but it's maybe a good sign. But I feel that there is a lot of, it's a theoretical frame for us to debate. But I feel that you've been driven by this kind of focus on contextual uniformity, contextual continuity, contextual juxtaposition, non-contextual juxtaposition. And I think it's like, it makes you blind of other issues. That annoys me a little, because I feel that it's a bit like you're forcing yourself to dedicate time about form and not about the content, and you're dedicating your time about the result and not the essence. So I feel that there are other issues that you have to tackle, even though you can address those theoretical approaches. But I feel that there is a lack of understanding of the programming in my own understanding of the current stage of the project, that not to be too functionalist, but at least trying to allow us a sense of ability to question the use and or other issues. So it's not a beauty contest. It's not about like it is formal, is it non-formal, is it contextual, non-contextual. I mean, this is an outcome. I mean, architecture is an outcome, and I feel that any moment you take a pen or you think architecture, it's a political thing. So don't worry, you will make political statement later on, you know? I think it's super important for me to share that because I feel you have a lot of great ability to think, but I feel that there is this kind of maneuver and formal issues that maybe it's not the right thing to talk about always.
Thank you. Great. Any other final comments on this project before we move on to the last project? Okay. Thank you. And we'll move on to the next project.
Just before you interrupt, I have to leave in 3 minutes, so I will say goodbye to everyone, but I enjoyed a lot the quality of your work. So I will start the introduction and leave. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clément. I'll see you soon.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for joining us here today. We are your last home stretch of the evening. My name is Isabel Clone and my partner is Thea Spring. And the title of our project today is Imported. As I'm sure that you know by now, the semester studio brief surrounded around questions of contemporary architecture within a historical context. And New Orleans has provided a unique position from which to consider this question. And as such, we want to begin with our statement concerning the topic. This project addresses the contemporary and historical context to find a new potential in contemporary architecture in New Orleans. By considering context and material at multiple scales, the site is examined through layers of the temporal and the physical. And through research on a regional, city, neighborhood, and site scale, our design of the program and public space attempts to bring a more layered approach than current typical contemporary architecture in New Orleans. We hope that it could provide a starting point for more multidisciplinary and careful considerations in the future developments of this rapidly densifying zone.
The Magazine Street is primarily associated with an area of New Orleans away from the French Quarter. It runs parallel to the river and eventually turns into Decatur. Magazine creates a link with some of the oldest parts of the city to the newest and remains an important street for the fabric of New Orleans. It holds a unique position as a street that connects multiple neighborhoods from the Garden District, Central Business District, and Warehouse District.
Trade through New Orleans port has been central to the city's success through the centuries. Beginning with trade with the French, Spanish, and British West Indies, New Orleans increasingly imported goods from Central America, Brazil, and the Caribbean to transfer to railroads which connected it to the rest of America. Fruit, coffee, and sugar imports soon expanded into New Orleans-based schemes to gain political and economic control over regions of Central America.
By the time the Panama Canal is built, New Orleans is one of the US's largest ports. The city's import economy launches a campaign arguing New Orleans is the logical point for a world exposition and all imports from Central America and the Caribbean. Though the exposition ends up taking place in San Francisco, it marks the beginning of a steady rise of regional imports in the first half of the 20th century. Coffee and bananas steal the show as European immigrants in New Orleans found Cuyamel standard fruit and United Fruit in the 1900s, soon expanding massive infrastructure and control in the region.
As a side note, Samuel Zemure, aka the Banana Man and founder of Cuyamel Fruit and later president of United Fruit, funded the establishment of the Tulane Latin American Studies and donated his home to the university, which the president now lives in. By the 1940s, 29 million banana stems a year are unloaded at the Thalia Street Wharf, just half a mile from our studio site on Magazine.
Though today most of the river is disconnected and hidden behind a thick band of industrial port and flood walls, we cannot help but think this identity should be acknowledged more strongly in contemporary New Orleans, to be seen and not just heard, as written by Rebecca Solnit in Unfathomable City. But the city has never lost its crucial identity as a great port, as a place whose native culture is based in absorbing the cultures of foreign lands and making them its own. And as an American city whose unique identity has been shaped, even before Jelly Roll Morton spoke of jazz's Spanish tinge, by the lifeways of Latin America and the Caribbean. From the time of the city's founding, the cords that bind New Orleans to the lands and peoples to its south have been thickened by many means. But in the early 1960s, as New Orleans was growing, work began on the construction of the new I-10 highway to connect to the 5-year-old Crescent City Bridge crossing the Mississippi River. And as New Orleans was connecting to these regions, its infrastructure created a divide in the very neighborhoods in which it had to thank for its inception. The highway eventually cut and carved into this fabric and further separated districts from one another. Our studio site is close neighbors to the highway, and foot traffic to the corner from varying neighborhoods have been forever altered and damaged.
As we zoom into the neighborhood scale, we began to look at the site through an archaeological grid framework, revealing things that had been demolished or altered over time. St. Margaret's Playground originally was a large triangular lot and nearly cut in half with the new construction of the highway. Today, it is only a small patch of grass, gated and surrounded by dangerous roads. Businesses and lots were demolished or cut in half. Crescent City Station was demolished with a second expansion, and Grosch's grocery store, a family-owned wholesaler, has left only its foundational row of bricks on the corner of Magazine Street. Certain adjoining buildings have absorbed those exterior walls into their interiors. Sifting through this grid reveals a palimpsest.
And in keeping with this disconnection that the highway created, informal residents and meeting places now inhabit the space under the highway. And it's clear to see there is a network and community of people here. Among many things, they lack access to water and decent bathrooms. And a few people we met tell us that the porta potties in the zone are often locked and unusable. And as our research began to form a program related to the city's port history, it was absolutely essential to also respond to these layers of the neighborhood's history and contemporary problems. The notion of contemporary architecture within this zone could not be considered without improving neighborhood connection across the highway, public space, and living situations for the informal housing across the road.
Zooming in further into the site scale, we continued our almost surgical approach to catalog the existing condition of these 100-year-old buildings. The billboard present in the parking lot proved to be the only sectional adjustment since the building of the I-10, capitalizing on the 609,000 impressions a week from commuting New Orleans.
And in looking at this reflected ceiling pan, the current state of the buildings on the site are that of disrepair. Rotten collapsing wood exposes the interior to rain and exterior conditions. And just this year, after Hurricane Zeta landed in New Orleans, parts of the CMU wall adjacent to the highway collapsed. Though the site is in such a condition, its material qualities and proportions attract the eye and seem to mark the history of labor on Magazine. From the highway, the compound of buildings almost look like a small movie set.
Our multiple visits as Tulane architecture students studying this area showed that most of the buildings on the right are filled with storage and old metal pieces, while the other one on the left, used historically as an auto shop, is currently leased by a cleaning service. The courtyard is fenced off for parking larger trucks. The front and side is used to park cars, but most of it remains empty, almost abandoned next to the highway. Through research on regional, city, and neighborhood scales, and with the addition of this last element of cultural clusters existing across the highway, we propose the Imported Museum. In both its program and materiality, the Imported Museum responds to aspects of contemporary architecture by creating needed new public spaces and services, new materials, and a new attention to a cultural spirit of New Orleans, that of its import history and Latin American influence. Now to take you through the building, if you can see it, partly with its program related to the museum is on the right side and following the existing footprint that defined a section of our program, as well as this layered research, which come with a few following responses: the extended threshold, a height difference that we will go into later, a water station where the past existing gas station was turned into a water station of shower and water access for public use, and a urban lamp, which we position in the corner, as well as an extension of the courtyard, a public courtyard cut into one of the existing buildings and opened up to provide the public space and next to a play space for children as previously existed in St. Margaret's Playground.
In conversation with the new programmatic elements of the site, it was important to design the facade of this new imported museum by looking especially at the existing facades as a relic of the past to inform a new material palette. We subdivided the facades into a series of points and plans to catalog layers of historic, industrial, commercial elements, which are rarely found in the often smooth contemporary architecture in New Orleans. Through both site and context, the context being defined as a 0.5 mile radius extending to the end of our studio site at Jackson Avenue and down to the Mississippi, we studied possible variations of facade materials to discover how we might provide a new palette, a method from which to study future potentials of contemporary materials. Additionally, we transcribed a more detailed fold-out of our site's facades to consider more precise details and ways of rethinking existing materials. This is an existing condition where we studied components that could be changed in response to some of the new needs of the neighborhood. This is a section of the existing facade on Magazine Street, closest to the highway. To form a public space that could inspire foot traffic once more, the smallest building on the site, which at present is entirely closed off, opens to connect the museum gift shop with Pedestrians on Magazine. Here, onlookers or bypassers can pick up a traditional New Orleans snowball or ice cream without actually entering the museum. And while opening of the smaller spaces creates a gift shop for the public, our response to the height of the highway is an extension of an unused entrance at the site. This new extension creates the new entrance into this building, and in doing so, it allows the building a new signage along the highway, a cultural element at equal heights with injury lawyers, and a playful contrast to the massive World War II museum. On the side facing toward the highway, a new screen allows for new digital advertisements.
In response to the often dark walk under the highway, the existing corrugated metal house on the corner is transformed into glass as a new source of light for the neighborhood, guiding the walk from the CBD to the Lower Garden District. On the highway side of the building, where there once was the gas filling station, a covered entrance provides a service of a water station with open water access and 2 rooms equipped with showers, bathrooms, and a changing area. Neons over each door allow for users to know from a distance if a water station room is available.
And at the time before the highway's inception, urban clues like well-loved and used utility poles showed just how much foot traffic came through the site from adjacent neighborhoods, such as the Central Business District and Warehouse District. Now, cars primarily drive by these urban clues, and the well-loved local poster has long since been gone. But the remnant of the textures left behind informed the new material to be used in possible future connections of glass elements. When we looked closer at the material, we realized even though this is a small scale, this too is a valid form in our built environment, a micro-architectural element, if you will. And lastly, in response to the lack of public space, playfulness, and the industrial elements used in the New Orleans port industry, we proposed a few interior and public space elements, such as the banana room, which would provide a modular hanging system to present artworks, a public reading room looking onto the courtyard, and a playpen and public courtyard between the two main buildings.
Our intention with this project is to reconsider a familiar sense of smoothness or novelty in contemporary architecture. Instead, we choose to emphasize the grit of a city, its history, and its narratives as they layer upon one another over time. In doing so, contemporary architecture in New Orleans can continue to contribute to the soul of the city. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you guys elaborate a little bit on this, on smoothness again? It's an interesting term. What do you, just elaborate on it a little bit?
Perhaps it was our discussions at the very beginning of what we love and what we don't love about contemporary architecture coming up in New Orleans. And there is that overarching quality of smoothness, which probably can also be explained as, you know, one or two materials, an almost diagram looking building. And that so much of the resolution ends up being lost or contrasting to what is existing around it, and trying to kind of explore how those could be closer to each other.
So you see smoothness as being sort of insertion of a simple material palette within any given context, and that smoothness is a kind of aesthetic quality that these buildings of that sort have.
Yeah, almost like you can feel that it's an equation that sometimes doesn't make you feel cared for.
What's the building that's smooth? Let's just give an example.
A lot of.
No, but you have to be specific. Like it's super important, because you're critiquing, and that's a good thing. And you know what you don't like, but you need to give it an example, or you need to demonstrate it more precisely.
I guess I can take a stab at that question. I think when we were considering, I know when we were considering a lot of contemporary architecture in New Orleans, in contrast with a lot of the historical material that is found in New Orleans, and that grit that we were talking about, is there's often quite a lot of sort of default to, as they had mentioned, an equation to the glass, or and especially in a context like Magazine too. I mean, we see a lot of new development there that has this material that can be inserted anywhere else.
Though. Point to a building, like point to an actual building, so we know what that means. Because it's super important. Because if there isn't an example, then you have an error in judgment.
And there is no right answer here. This is how you construct it.
Right.
You're going to construct for us your theory of smoothness.
I mean, I would say development down on Julia Street, just a few blocks down. I would say some of the recent developments by EDR. You know, a lot of these buildings have intense connections with Tulane University. So how many?
We're walking a fine line here.
But that's okay. I mean,
just a general.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like you're saying these are terrible buildings, but what you're suggesting is that there's an alternative way to evaluate successful buildings.
Right.
And you have this framework that you want to demonstrate as a plausible alternative. And it's nothing to say that's negative of the other projects. It's just an alternative framework. right? And so an EDR project, that's fine. So like a limited material palette, it looks slick. It looks like when we imagine like, you know, contemporary design, you know, it's the limited material palette, metal. Is that what you're talking about? Like metal facades?
Glass, brick, lots of brick everywhere.
Smoothness for you has something to do with cleanliness.
Like
something to do with unfetteredness. Is it different than rough?
Is a Donald Judd sculpture too smooth for you?
I was gonna just insert here that like when I first reviewed the presentation, I thought that you were leading in a direction where you weren't gonna alter the existing architecture that much. And then I just got a little confused at the end with like the actual elevation, because it does seem in the end to be really altered. And I didn't see like a final Magazine Street rendering of it, but I think that like ad hoc character of that site that was so appealing to you, it would have been interesting, I think, to program the buildings more as is with like more contemporary interventions of like entrances and additional program, than to just try to borrow from the materials of it and save some of the form but not others, because then you've altered that uniqueness. You've inserted your own, I guess, interpretation of it. So I found the presentation a little bit confusing in that way. And I was gonna say, like, it does seem like you're taking the stance that the program should be really responsive to the site. And I think that would have been an interesting way to address maybe some of the community pushback to some of the offerings that you're providing with these public amenities like restrooms and water stations, is to, I think, to keep the architecture as is almost brings about the question of like, well, what is the offensive move then? Because this neighborhood does have a tendency to get kind of outraged by either contemporary looking buildings or programmatic proposals that aren't in line with what they consider to be their values. So I just think it's interesting, like it doesn't go far enough on either front. Like I think you altered the architecture significantly enough where you lose some of that ad hoc nature of the movie set feel. And then that addition of that programmatic element where you're giving back to the community is not a large enough move to be a statement in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would maybe argue, not argue, but I would maybe point out that I think there's a lot of projects in New Orleans that are doing what you're interested in. More so than a lot of places that I've lived in, for example. Have you ever been to Music Box Village? Do you like it or hate it?
Love it.
Why do you love it?
Because it's ad hoc, yeah. But
yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's a whole nother conversation.
But I mean,
yeah.
like, that's like your ally, yeah. Right? So, I mean, when I was in school, we had to define our friends and our enemies. We had to be that sort of straight up about what we like and what we don't like. And it was useful because then I could start to position myself with respect to disciplinary decisions that I make. And I'm participating in a lineage, I'm participating in a conversation. I know where my allegiances are, and I know what I don't have to care about. You know what I mean? And you want to be able to point those things out so that when it comes time to sort of make your case, you know what you can leave behind, what's not part of the conversation. And I think like you've landed on stuff that's super important, like smoothness. Like, I don't know, there's a bunch of us on the panel who, when we were in school, smoothness was something else. Like that was a different discussion. And so I think, you know, again, when something is stated and how it's stated relative to that time is super important. And so I think like you're onto something really healthy here, and the project is great. You know.
If I may just
just to further
sorry.
what you were saying, I think if you were to define, to look at the use of the term, hey, we're going back to smoothness again, but to look at the way people have used the term smooth in the past, and contrast the way that you see smoothness in relation to the past, or highlight the continuity between the change in the meaning of the term. That would help a lot. It's kind of a loaded phrase, as he was saying in architecture. I was hoping, I see a smoothness in this project, but it's not the smoothness that you see. I see a kind of smooth transformation of this place versus a kind of convulsive, imposition of a new building. You're really taking kind of incremental, a kind of gentle steps toward changing this. To me, that suggests a kind of smooth change over time. That might be something you could comment on, or something that you could, be amplify in your discussion about the project.
I like the project in a myriad of ways. To say that I really appreciated first of all, the drawings, the sequence of drawings, and the way through drawing, you're collecting the different life of the city, even movement of ships in the water. So the idea of drawing as an artifact to record life and performance, I think that's visible in a way. You also emphasize layers of history, and you kind of make links with things at different scales. It seems to me that all these attitudes, on the one hand, the talent for drawing, but the talent to construct or deconstruct an existing architecture material in terms of form, program, etc. Altogether, it seems to me that it's a certain attitude, that the one you have, and it's really visible in this proposal, an attitude of politeness or educated, smooth maybe, or not to get into this war, because that has kind of taken too much over. But I think one of the most difficult things in architecture, and that's a sentence from Rafael Moneo, it says that the most difficult thing is to get right the attitude, or to because you can develop a language, an architectural language, that's something that you will talk with, but the other is what to say. And the way you're saying what you want to say is really polite, and really taking in account accumulative layers of history and different references. I think this is absolutely great in a contemporary moment like today, where we have to spend less energy and be more attentive to what is going on around us. Not to say that the other gestures that are like one material, one gesture, and one bold movement are not good, perhaps, but this is almost the opposite, and I rather prefer that one, actually.
So, Taya and Isabel, I really like this project, and thank you very much. What I really appreciate is your use of the word grit, because I think that's really what this is all about, is sort of, incorporating and celebrating the grit. I think it's very interesting that you include the water station with the showers, in a complex where there's a children's playground. You're speaking to the population who tends to gather, I think, in part under the interstate. I've seen that sort of juxtaposition here in Audubon Park, where in the shelter at Audubon Park, next to the children's playground. There are people who are gathered because there's shelter there and there's water there. I very much support, those sorts of, impositions facing opportunities and needs in the city. One relevant project I think you might look at. Do you know the Hastings Museum on the Sussex coast in England? It's built in a fisherman's village community. These beautiful 2-story. Has anybody been there? Small black, very tall, very small footprint buildings, which were built. They're papered in black tar paper, and they were built for hanging the nets, right, from 2 stories. In any case, the Hastings Art Museum is a contemporary museum, and it's built within the context of these working fishermen's storage units. It's absolutely fantastic, but that's the kind of a juxtaposition of, this smell of the fish and the hanging of the ropes with contemporary art, and bringing all this together that I think you're trying to do here. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate also very much the, pointing toward the historical context, the gritty historical context of the city and the port. So that's what I have to say about that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any final comments about this project from our reviewers?
I have a few more maybe, but I don't.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm curious still to hear. I really care about this stuff, and I think it's really interesting work. Differentiate Music Box Village from the Gehry House.
Funding.
What does that mean?
That means the money is coming from very different places, and like most anything related to art, maybe this relates to the past conversations, but what the music box is and what it could be depends on money to me, or how long it survives, how much of ad hoc it is. Ideally, it would have a bit of both.
I don't know the budgetary constraints. There's probably people on the panel that know that better about the Gehry House, but I can't imagine that was like a high concept piece that was like super expensive to build. But I think what you mean is sort of like there was a different sort of sense of authorship involved. There was like a singular sort of visionary versus the sensibility of a collective, or the sensibility of a place, perhaps, rather than like an ism. So I put the book Ad Hocism by Jenks in the chat. I think you need to be able to differentiate ad hoc from, I think Music Box Village, actually, if that's really the tenor, and I have plenty of problems with Music Box Village, but like, I think like ad hocism versus that is also different, and I think it might have to do with authorship. I'm not totally sure, but like intellectually, this is important to me, and I think it should be important to both of you.
So Ben, to clarify real fast too, what you would say there is that Gehry works as a singular vision, but he's working with these layers, with this lots of embedded stuff, whereas as we're understanding Music Box Village, more of a collective approach, and it's all these voices that are creating this thing, and this is what you're seeing as really important to the framework. Is that correct, Ben? And
Yeah.
as well,
I think so.
I think that's a really strong point, because you, as an architect, well, there's a couple stances. Now everything's about collaboration now, but let's pretend you don't collaborate. You have to have a clear way of working. And so I think what Ben is insisting is that you understand that clear way of working versus, and don't make a point to something like Music Box Village, which the reality is, it's like, it is an artist collective. So we're like all rolled in a weird ball with that previous project. And it's a little bit of that conversation too. And the complexity of it. But yeah, I tend to agree. It's important. I did like your graphics, by the way. I had to step out for part of it, but I remember y'all's project from before, and today I do like y'all's graphics. They're nice. They're consistent.
But can we talk about the Gary House and the Music Box Village, in terms of intellectual framework, and where, Gary is pursuing, there is a clear intellectual framework that he is pursuing or initiating with his house, where the Music Village, Music Box Village, is something that that doesn't have that. And to me, that is a very important distinction. Well, in that, your project is more the Gary House than the Music Village Box, because I think there is an intellectual framework to your project that is very clear, that is pushing against something that is trying to define what is what exists on the site and how to transform it, how to change it in a very homeopathic or surgical way, rather than heavy-handed. The same way Gary did with his project. And I don't think the question is a budget, or I think to me that the biggest distinction between these two projects is the intellectual framework.
Yeah, I mean, one's more kind of, I don't know if this is the right word, but like accretional, or one's more additive, one's more, like the Music Box Theater to me is more kind of unplanned.
Yeah.
There are drawings for the Gary House.
Could you say that one is a kind of, there's just a basic armature of rules that, and everybody, almost anybody is invited to participate in carrying out in creating the project, contributing to the project, as long as they stay within those rules. Whereas the Gary House is a direct attempt to analyze and respond to the context, but to kind of use technology and use kind of improve upon it with lifting the house above the ground, putting solar panels on it, blah blah blah. One is completely unplanned, and one, or almost unplanned, and the other is highly planned. So I don't think they're that close to being. It's hard to talk about them the same way. I mean, I don't think there's I would be curious to know, which one do you guys like? Which one are you doing? There's no right answer. Which one would you prefer to do?
I'm sorry. I don't know why we're putting Isabel and Tay in this position. I honestly don't. It's not that we can't critique the project, but the Music Box Village was, constructed. There was nothing that, I mean, there may be pieces there that were there, but what we use there and what we enjoy there is a playground, constructed to be a playground. It's a completely different, I agree with Amar. I don't really understand why they're being asked to choose one over the other, or say that they like one over the other in relationship to this particular project.
They said
Well,
it.
I mean, because if you're going to make the music box village, I think that a lot of architects want to do that, but architecture typically doesn't allow us to do that. It kind of falls outside of the disciplinary boundaries of architecture to do something like that. And I'm always curious when a student demonstrates like some kind of impulse to do something like that, if they're hesitating because it doesn't seem like the discipline will let them do it.
I like the question a lot, and I'm sure Isabel does too. Maybe, or at least my first reaction is, and one of our main questions is time. Can you only do this kind of music box project when you have time? And I've gone through ad hoc, Charles Jenks, I know a bit more about bricolage, but bricolage and those kinds of concepts only exist as reactions to things. So can you create in that way? And it seems maybe one architect that did that kind of work that we enjoy a lot is Bruce Goff, who did use pieces of things, and maybe almost at the right time, he used leftover industrial pieces for one house and then started something totally new for another. It feels like bricolage, but it doesn't. So yeah, the question is open, but
this is where, to me, the idea of an intellectual framework, I mean, it seems ad hoc. It seems that he just picked up the leftover material and he did something with them, but everything was very intentional. It wasn't just, let's build something without, just because we need, a stage here or room, let's, take it. And I think there is much more intention than, and if you look at the work, you see that there is a continuity or an evolution of some sort. And to me, that is the reflection of what I'm calling an intellectual framework that, whether it's the Gary House or Bruce Goff, work, it provides.
It's important as you go on to work. Why this becomes important is it goes back to this discussion about freedom and a lot of the kind of heady things that architects really can't answer. But the one thing we can do is this idea of specifying and being, intentional. Because when you go to, and this goes to when you actually go to build something, you actually build it. You can be the architect that is going to specify every single bolt all the way down to where it's specified and the angle of some piece, all of it to be specified. It may look ad hoc, but has been specified to very clear instructions. Or you are creating up rule sets. You can make objects 20 foot on center, north, south, east, west, place objects, at which point somebody else can come in and use those rule sets and it's looser. Yeah. All of these are ways of defining things. And that's the difference here.
Yeah.
And you may not even have something may be so loose that it isn't. Place wood and steel objects 20 foot on center, don't care about anything else, walk off, don't ever talk to anybody. Versus really nailing it. I mean, drilling every single thing down. And there are people out there, Mars on the call, look at his house. You think Mars' house looks a certain way. And I can promise you, it's very dialed in, very, very dialed in. And that is, there's a clear difference there. There's also a certain personality that goes on. There's all these other layers that go on with these things. Very important as to how you live and who you are, and this ability to let go. There's also an element of letting go, which is powerful for all people and humans, spiritual, that goes into all this stuff. And all of that is really important. And that's why we're talking about. And as architects, I think we are always swinging on that pendulum and trying to find that sweet spot for who we are in that, how much we want to specify versus how much we can let go and still find beauty and still feel like an architect. Yeah. That's the magic of it. And we talked about it in projects, and that's kind of the magic can occur between specifying the bolt and just setting a loose set of rules. It can all be there.
That defines what I was probing for. what's your, because is it, I feel like the loose set of rules is often not given enough, we don't give enough permission to define the loose set of rules, you know, for architects. We are in the discipline of architecture, because of liability, you know, we're always expected to define everything and to define it safely. We're not allowed to, you know, let the guy who used to run the auto parts store decide how he's going to hang, you know, the bunches of bananas. That's just not, you know, they might fall on somebody's head and kill him. So, but I think that, you know, it's a question that that is worth asking yourself, because what kind of architect do you want to be? I think it's totally fine to be either way. Are you going to be Jacques Herzog, or are you going to be, you know, Rem Koolhaas in 1995 when he designed like the International Exposition and just created some basic framework for chaos to happen within?
Yeah. Right. I think the closest built example that I can think of, maybe, I don't know the Goff work that well, but the brewery, the Live Work Artist Colony in Los Angeles, by Roto Architects. You got to look that one up. It was all built kind of ad hoc, no permits. There were no drawing set. They'd go and draw while they were constructing. And that might be the closest.
I mean, I think that to ad hoc deserves maybe more definition. I don't think I've ever read that Charles Jenks essay. So, but one can be extraordinarily precise in taking a found object and building it into an existing structure, or building it into a new structure. And that's a history that is well worn in, you know, Japanese temples and tea houses and in contemporary work. And yet that work is extraordinarily precise in its execution. It is like, as he was saying, the precise definition and the precise prescription of every single bolt and every single screw is defined. It's just not defined in a kind of modernist systemized way. It's not, so it's no less precise. But I mean, I think, like, for me, like, those are questions I have to ask myself every day. Like when I'm working on a project, is what's the attitude towards that kind of, towards it? How much latitude do I want to give the guy in the field? How much latitude do I want to give the owner? What, you know, they can make their own decisions. Am I okay with that?
Great conversation. Great way to wrap up this this afternoon. I would like to hear from our reviewers some feedback on the studio setup in general, and general comments about what you saw this afternoon.
I saw a lot of really rigorous analysis, and every project, it was different. And to me, that always shows that people are developing their own voice. And that's what I want to see in architectural education, and well done.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that. And I think there's a ton of work that was put into this studio. And, you know, I think like something that I'm kind of increasingly fascinated on is a resurgence of regionalism post-globalism. And I'm thinking about that in the context of some of the work that you're doing. And I think that can start to be pretty exciting, actually, kind of reinvigorating the regional. And I think that also is in part maybe related to Amar's identity versus specificity ideas. And I think that's a really important way to start thinking about work. And whether it's those two words or other, you know, ideas that pop into your head, I think it's important. It starts to get me thinking about high level and low level intentions. And for those of you that have taken a class with me, you've heard me talk about that. And that's in relation to a piece by Randall Dipert, who was talking about intentions in relation to reproducing a composer's work. And what are the high level intentions and the low level intentions of a project. And I think identity and specificity, you might be able to start thinking about layers of intention along those lines. And regarding the contemporary, I always think about this one line, I don't know where I heard it, but just wherever you go, there you are. And I'll leave you with that.
I was happy to see the depth of the urban and historical analyses that were presented in the projects. I think, and there's just so much good work, good serious work that's been done here. I didn't say anything during Midge and Reed's presentation, but I was so happy to see that that they took on the sort of extremes of the project and tried to imagine, you know, how one can approach this theoretically. The problem there, it seems to me, is that, you know, in taking on the two sites, it was difficult really to completely design both those buildings so that you could really discuss them in even greater depth. And I think that's the problem with the ambitions of this studio, Omar. I mean, but the great thing about this studio is that you can take it on another year, right? Is that true? You can keep working on this. So, you know, and maybe you'll have a different site, and you know, maybe there'll be a completely new set of projects. But the extent to which the individual buildings can be sort of thoroughly designed, I think, is a question that has to arise out of this studio. There are a lot of propositions on the table, and I think the sort of expanse and the horizon of the propositions may be more important, maybe, than the actual designs of the buildings themselves. But I think that is for me, it's the clear remaining question to be answered. But thank you all. I know you put in a great deal of work and it paid off.
Yeah, I'll just say I really appreciate some of the real aspects of the studio that have defined the responses to the different sites, like zoning and context and the historical data, because those things really do govern what we do. And when you practice in a city like New Orleans, those things are always important, no matter what site you're working on. And so it's been interesting for me to see from a student perspective where there's a lot of time to do that kind of initial research, what ideas kind of stood out to everybody, and everybody seemed to have a different interest and response. But the shaping of the projects by the local context is really interesting, because at the end of the day, the projects are similar in scale and size because they're dictated by lot sizes and allowable heights. And so I think that establishing those criteria really helped shape the responses, and that allowed us to talk fluently about the differences and how you respond to them.
I agree. I think it was really good. I like the front end analysis was strong. I really like the format of this studio as well. It's kind of research based. It's analytical. I think always, and this is for all of us, is continue, as we know, that y'all got a little reaction out of me out of the project before last. But that's serious stuff. I take it really serious. The reason I react that way is because I find it serious, is that question everything, but also as you go to practice, the reason that reaction is that way, and I can find kind of calling it a reaction, is definitely emotional, and you're going to have to know your clients. you have to know everything about them, actually. And I think part of my frustration is when you pose something, always try to dig deeper and figure out what's actually going on. And for that, I'm going to be more specific. As architects and as we move forward, understand funding. Architects too often avoid money. And for design, kind of how we got into almost a catch in talking about ad hoc and trying to say that the difference between those two projects is money. In that case, it wasn't. It was intellectual. It's how we work. But in a lot of cases, and almost in every case, one way to understand something is through funding and some of that. And then it does overlay with politics or something like that. And then we don't want to go down that hole again but do continue to ask questions. It's a really good studio. Y'all's work was really good. I think when you saw the breadth of the conversations, and another good thing is when we're actually not talking about buildings a lot. To me, that's actually when you're having a really good architectural conversation. That's because your projects are pulling that out of us. And that's when you get these really deep conversations. And so I think y'all were doing that, and congrats.
Great. Thank you so much. I would like to thank all of our reviewers this afternoon. I know we're way past time. Thank you so much again. I thought that the conversation was great this afternoon. And I will see you all very soon. I would like to have a few minutes with the students, if you just can stay for a few more minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool.